world violence. We have seen this happen time and time again, from the 2017 neo-Nazi Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, that was organized using a Facebook event page, to the violent January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol, spurred to action in part by Stop the Steal content that repeatedly surfaced online, to the shooter who live streamed as he massacred black shoppers at a Buffalo supermarket. There is a clear connection between online content and offline violence. Over the years, we have heard many explanations from social media companies about their content moderation policies, efforts to boost trust and safety, and actions taken to remove harmful accounts. There's no question that those efforts are certainly important, but there's a question of whether those actions are enough to effectively address the spread of dangerous content online and the resulting threats it poses to our homeland security. The central question is not what content the platforms can take down once it is posted, but how they design their products in a way that boosts this content in the first place, and whether they build those products with safety in mind to effectively address how harmful content spreads. And that is the focus of today's hearing. We will have the opportunity to hear from two panels of witnesses, outside experts, including former Facebook and Twitter executives, as well as the current senior executives from Meta, YouTube, TikTok, and Twitter, who are charged with designing social media products used by billions of people all across the world. The overwhelming majority of social media users have very little information about why they see certain recommended content in their feeds. And there's very limited transparency into how social media companies balance their business decisions with the need for online safety, including what resources they invest to limiting the spread of harmful content. Our goal is to better understand how companies' business models and incentive structures, including revenue generation, growth, and employee compensation, determine how social media products are built, and the extent to which current incentives contribute to the amplification of content that threatens homeland security. For nearly a year, I've been pressing Meta, YouTube, TikTok, and Twitter for more information on their policies to monitor and to remove extremist and conspiracy content that advocates violence, as well as the relationship between their recommendation algorithms and targeted advertising tools that generate much of the company's revenues and the amplification of extremist content. The company's response to those inquiries have been incomplete and insufficient so far. This morning, we'll hear from two former executives and a technology journalist with social media expertise about the internal product development process and the business decisions that these companies make, including trade-offs between revenues and growth and their trust and safety efforts, as well as how they interact with foreign governments. Later this afternoon, we'll hear directly from the chief product officers of Meta, YouTube, and Twitter, and the chief operating officer of TikTok, the executives who are charged with making those business decisions and driving the strategic vision of the companies. I certainly look forward to a productive discussion with both panelists. Welcome to this committee here today. We look forward to your testimony. Ranking Member Portman, you're now recognized for your opening comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the experts for being here. We look forward to hearing from you. It's going to be an interesting hearing. This past Sunday, we observed the 21st anniversary of the tragic 9/11 terrorist attacks. And over these past couple of decades, our country has adapted to combat the most pressing threats to our nation's security, and that's good. But the advent of social media has added a new dimension to the ever-evolving threat landscape and created new considerations for combating terrorism, human trafficking, and many other threats. During last October's hearing on how algorithms promote harmful content, I focused on how social media business models contribute to the amplification of terrorism and other dangerous activities. Since then, the committee has identified ways in which social media companies' product development processes tend to conflict with user safety. Whistleblower testimony has revealed that in numerous occasions, the leaders at social media companies were aware that certain platform features increase threats to user safety and chose not to mitigate such concerns. We'll hear about that today. It's unfortunate that the American public must wait for whistleblower disclosures to find out about ways in which platforms are knowingly and unknowingly harming their users. The lack of transparency in the product development process, the obscurity of algorithms, and misleading content moderation statistics create an asymmetric information environment in which the platforms know all, yet the users and policymakers and the public actually know very little. One consequence of this lack of transparency is related to China. I have serious concerns about the opportunities that the Chinese Communist Party has to access TikTok's data on American users. There are now over 100 million Americans, including 40 million under the age of 19, who use TikTok. This TikTok data remains vulnerable to the Communist Party of China, both as the CCP tries to exploit its access to U.S. data and exert influence over the content that U.S. users see. For example, despite moving U.S. data servers to the United States, TikTok and ByteDance employees in China retain the ability to access this data. If that's not true, we'd like to hear about that today. Also, we learned yesterday from Senator Grassley's opening statement in a Senate Judiciary Committee hearing with the Twitter whistleblower that Twitter failed to prevent Americans' data from being accessed by foreign governments. In fact, Senator Grassley spoke about how several Twitter employees were actually foreign agents of India, China, and Saudi Arabia, which is concerning and speaks to why Congress needs more information from platforms on how they secure user data. Another consequence of poor transparency relates to content moderation. While I recognize that content moderation is a key component to creating safe platforms for users, it cannot be the only thing. Transparency reports released by companies often detail the amount of content that has been removed for violating company policy. However, these reports do not account for violating content that is left up to the platform and left up on the platform and yet goes undetected. It also doesn't account for content that is incorrectly censored, as we often see with many conservative voices on social media. I, like many of my colleagues, have been critical of the political biases held by big tech platforms, which have resulted in systematic takedowns of accounts that hold ideologies with which the left and liberal media disagree. We'll hear about that today, but these takedowns are often done under the guise of combating misinformation, which, in fact, they're really just combating conservative viewpoints that conflict with their own. Any steps taken to address the impact of social media and homeland security must account for First Amendment protections, of course, and safeguard free speech. For us to have a responsible conversation about the impact of harmful content on American users and homeland security, we need to talk about how current transparency efforts have worked or not worked. Congress must enact legislation that will require tech companies to share necessary data so that research can be done to evaluate the true extent of how harms from social media impact Americans. As some of you know, I've been working on legislation along those lines with Senator Coons to establish bipartisan legislation to do just that. The Platform Accountability and Transparency Act would require the largest tech platforms to share data with vetted, independent researchers and other investigators so that we can all increase our understanding of the inner workings of social media companies and regulate the industry based on good information that we simply don't have now, that we can learn through this process. So again, I thank the witnesses for being here. Look forward to you having your expertise help to guide us in these complicated issues. And thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing.
Well, thank you, Ranking Member Portman. It is the practice of this committee to swear in witnesses, so if each of you would please stand and raise your right hands. Do you swear that the testimony you will give before this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? You may be seated. Today's first witness is Alex Rutter, the former Senior Vice President of Engineering at Twitter. In his previous role, Mr. Rutter helped grow Twitter's monthly active users to over 300 million and build the ads network from near zero revenue to $2.5 billion a year. Mr. Rutter also spent 6 years at Google on a variety of projects, including building the world's largest computational advertising platform. He was in the room for major decisions about products at Twitter and is familiar with the priorities that were weighed as products were created, as well as how those products are then built. Mr. Rutter, welcome to the committee. You may proceed with your opening remarks.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me here today. We live in a world where an unprecedented number of people consume information from social networks. Viral content and misinformation can propagate on these platforms on a scale that's unseen in human history. Regulators must understand companies' incentives, culture, and processes to appreciate how unlikely voluntary reform is. In over 20 years of working in Silicon Valley as an engineer, as an executive, I've seen firsthand how several of these companies work. Today, I will talk about how these companies operate and actionable ways to demand transparency. The product development lifecycle works as follows. First, teams of product managers, engineers, and designers are assigned specific metrics to maximize. These metrics carefully track user engagement and growth, as well as revenue and financial indicators. Other metrics, such as user safety, are either not present or much less important. Second, teams use an experimental system to launch changes to small percentages of users. The effect of every experiment on key metrics is measured extremely accurately. Absent are detailed metrics tracking impacts on user safety. For example, I never once saw a measurement such as, did a given experiment increase or decrease the spread of content later identified as hate speech? And third, executives review these experimental dashboards regularly and make decisions on which experiments to launch. These reviews are run by product and engineering. Other functions like legal or trust and safety are absent or do not play a substantial role. Culturally, these companies are in formal hierarchies, with the builders, by which I mean engineers, product managers, and designers, held in the highest regard. Other functions are viewed much more skeptically. The strong bias is to make sure that corporate bureaucracy does not slow down product development. These companies conduct regular performance evaluations and promotions, and these drive peer recognition, career advancement, and cash and stock awards. The main data collected is what impact an individual's work has on key metric families. Only a minority of builders get promoted based on impact to trust and safety metrics, as those impacts are not valued as highly. What data has been shared selectively to date is mostly non-illuminating statistics designed to create the appearance that they're taking the problem seriously. When one of the largest companies in the world says it is spending what seems like a large absolute number, that number must be put in context and compared to the size of other initiatives, for example, product efforts or how much they spend on stock buybacks. Large investments and amounts are not sufficient. We must demand transparency based on measuring actual results. Similarly, when a company points to how much content it has taken down, that has to be understood in terms of its reach in the network. Removing a billboard in Wyoming is very different than removing a billboard in Times Square. For real transparency, I recommend assembling an independent group of researchers and data scientists. Task them with enumerating the right questions to ask and the set of data they need to answer them. Fund them to continually do this work and refine their questions and data requests. The government is able to demand transparency in technically demanding fields. For example, third-party auditors of public company financial statements are able to balance the public's need for reliable financial statements with the company's need to keep information confidential. Until such transparency exists, every assurance by any of these companies has to be taken on faith. Transparency is necessary but not sufficient. Until we change the fact that user attention and profits are what companies care about above all else, all the data sharing in the world will not address the problem. Policy and legal experts have previously testified before the committee on ways that incentives could be changed. Incentives matter. Companies behave differently when they care about the quality of content. For example, having inappropriate ads could materially harm financial performance, so most advertising systems place ad copy removal as a step that has to occur before the new ad ever makes its way to users. On the other hand, user-generated content is allowed to go live instantly. Incentives also shape companies' recommendation algorithms. For example, TikTok and ByteDance feed young people in China a diet of educational, science, and math content via their recommendation algorithms. The Chinese version of the app even enforces a daily usage limit. Contrast this to how US companies target content to young Americans, optimizing their engagement and revenue at any cost. Any suggestion for more useful transparency will be met with many objections. The status quo is simply too lucrative. Do not underestimate these companies' ability to fight requests for information. After all, the legal team at Google alone has the same number of lawyers as all the employees of the FTC. Given what we know about companies' incentives, processes, and culture, we should not expect meaningful progress voluntarily, and we should view their commitments extremely skeptically. However, with the proper transparency and regulatory environment, I believe we can change their incentives and start to see real, measurable progress against these problems. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next witness is Brian Boland, a former Vice President of Partnerships, Product Marketing, Partner Engineering, Marketing, Strategic Operations, and Analytics at Facebook. Mr. Boland worked at Facebook for 11 years. He worked in several roles, including leading a 500-person multi-function team focused on product strategy, market strategy, partner engineering, operations, analytics, and marketing. These high-impact teams worked across Facebook products and features, including Watch, Video, News, Group Admins, Developers, Payments, and Audience Network. And before joining Facebook, he worked at Microsoft and other tech companies. Mr. Boland, welcome to the committee. You may proceed with your opening remarks.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Thank you for holding these hearings that cover such important issues for our nation and the world. And thank you for inviting me here today to provide testimony on my experiences as a senior executive at Facebook, now known as Meta. For the last few years, I've grown increasingly concerned about the roles that Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Twitter, and TikTok play in driving the growth of misinformation, extremism, and generally harmful content. I worked at Facebook for 11 years in a variety of leadership roles, helping to shape product and market strategies for a broad array of products, including advertising, news, video, media, and more. During my tenure at the company, I worked with the most senior executives and was deeply embedded in the product development process. In my last 2 years of my time at the company, the CrowdTangle team and product was a part of my organization. CrowdTangle is a tool that provides limited, albeit industry-leading, transparency into public newsfeed content on Facebook. What finally convinced me that it was time to leave was that despite growing evidence that the newsfeed may be causing harm globally, the focus on and investments in safety remained small and siloed. The documents released by Frances Haugen, the Facebook whistleblower who last fall testified here, highlight issues around polarization globally and the power of Facebook to lead people down a path to more extreme beliefs. These papers demonstrate thoughtful, well-researched documentation of the harms that concerned me. The research was done by highly skilled Facebook employees who are experts in their field and was extensive. And rather than address the serious issues raised by its own research, Meta leadership chooses growing the company over keeping people safe. While the company has made investments in safety, these investments are small and routinely abandoned if they will impact company growth. My experience at Facebook was that rather than seeking to research and discover issues on the platform before others found them, they'd rather reactively work to mitigate the PR damage for issues that came to light. I've come to believe that several circumstances have put Americans at risk from the content on these platforms. The first is the growth over safety incentive structure that leads to products that are designed and built without a primary focus on safety. The next is the unprecedented lack of transparency available from these platforms so that we can analyze content and understand the impact from these tools. And finally, the lack of clear oversight for the business practices of these companies. We've faced challenges like this before with new technologies. In the 1960s, Congress addressed the dramatic rise in fatalities caused by the rapid increase in automobile use in the United States. That industry experienced explosive growth and the companies focused on growth in sales. And it turns out safety didn't sell. The creation of the Nhtsa, at the time the NHSB, empowered an agency to study the available data and in partnership with researchers and other agencies to take steps to make driving in America rapidly and significantly safer. Today, automobile manufacturers prioritize safety as a selling point such that they welcome verification of these efforts. The problem with these social media platforms today is that we lack public data to understand the current issues. And there's extremely limited ability to research these platforms and almost no ability to protect our future and create a version of crash testing the car. Imagine if in the 1960s we had no way of knowing the deaths that were happening from cars and that we had no way of knowing that it was increasing so rapidly. That lack of data is where we are today with social media platforms. The reality is that for all the debate about whether social media is predominantly good or bad, the truth is that we don't really know. And if anyone tells you they know, they don't know. I believe that we have a right to know. The good news is that with the right incentives in place and rules around transparency, we can develop a better understanding of these issues and take steps to mitigate the harms. If we take these steps, we can do now what we did with the automobile. We can empower agencies and researchers to deeply understand the issues, and through changes in incentives, public education, and better development, build a path to a future where we still get the amazing benefits from these products while mitigating the harms that we barely understand today. Today, I hope to shed light on the product development process, internal and external incentive structures for these organizations, and the critical importance of transparency. I appreciate your work to better understand these issues and deliver real-world solutions to the American people. Thank you.
Thank you. Our final witness of our first panel is Jeffrey Kane, the Senior Fellow for Critical Emerging Technologies at Lincoln Network. Mr. Kane is an award-winning foreign correspondent and author. His work has taken him to the world's most authoritarian and remote places, from inside North Korea to the Trans-Siberian Railway across Russia, from investigations into genocide in Cambodia to experiments in technological surveillance in China. Mr. Kane has served as a Tech Congress Fellow with the House Foreign Affairs Committee Minority and supported a range of issues including China, tech sanctions, and investigative work. Mr. Kane, welcome to our committee. You may proceed with your opening comments.
Good morning, Chairman Peters, Ranking Member Portman, and members of the committee. It is an honor to be invited to testify here today on social media's impact on national security. Today, I will talk about one of the greatest technological threats facing our homeland security and democracy, TikTok, the social media app that reports to a nefarious Chinese company called ByteDance. As an investigative journalist in China and East Asia for 13 years, I have been detained, harassed, and threatened from my reporting on Chinese technology companies. Today, I will show you how TikTok has orchestrated a campaign of distraction and deflection to mask the alarming truth. Americans face the grave and unprecedented threat of software in our pockets that contains powerful surveillance and data gathering capabilities, owned by private companies that must comply with the dictates of a foreign authoritarian government ruled under the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP. The CCP has signaled its ambitions to assert global jurisdiction over private companies everywhere as a condition for doing business in China. TikTok, therefore, is a disaster waiting to happen for our security and the privacy of our citizens. We'll have TikTok executives here today later. According to their internal public relations guidelines leaked to the media, they are required to, quote, downplay the parent company ByteDance, downplay the China Association, and downplay AI. The public relations guideline states that if you ask them about the influence of the Chinese company ByteDance and its influence over its American product, TikTok, which is used by many Generation Z teenagers, executives must deceptively tell you that ByteDance is a separate company in China and that you should talk to ByteDance instead. They will attempt to confuse you, claiming that TikTok takes a localized approach, hiring local moderators, implementing local policies, and showing local content. They won't tell you about an individual who is unnamed so far called the master admin in Beijing. This has been leaked to the media, to BuzzFeed, who has had access to all Americans' data. They also will not tell you that they at TikTok report to ByteDance executives in China, and ByteDance reports to the Chinese Communist Party. TikTok's fast expansion into the American market was only possible because China has rigged the market. The Chinese government offered ByteDance vast market protection in China, all while banning competing American social media apps Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and Google. Like all Chinese companies, ByteDance runs an in-house Communist Party committee that enforces the political loyalty of its employees. In 2018, ByteDance and TikTok's founder and previous CEO, a man named Zhang Yiming, wrote a letter, public letter, promising Chinese regulators that his company would follow, quote, core socialist values, unquote, would introduce these, quote, correct values into technology and products, and would ensure his products promoted the Chinese Communist Party's agenda. These values, he wrote, included, quote, strengthening the work of the party construction, quote, deepening cooperation with official party media, and strengthening, quote, content review in line with these party values. ByteDance's public statements in China should be cause for alarm, considering American government employees, military personnel, and workers in sensitive and strategic industries use TikTok. When TikTok began growing its presence in the US in 2016 and 2017, I was an investigative journalist in China's western region of Xinjiang, where I was writing my second book, The Perfect Police State, which is an investigation into the Chinese surveillance dystopia. I learned that ByteDance and TikTok was expanding into America, and I knew that this was ominous because I had been speaking to a former worker for the Ministry of State Security, a major intelligence and extremely powerful intelligence body who had told me that he had worked with numerous companies, including ByteDance, to expose the data of ethnic minorities in China. It wasn't hard, it simply happened. ByteDance has also had an active role in suppressing news about the atrocities, which included physical and psychological torture, internment in concentration camps, forced sterilizations, and the wholesale of destructions of mosques and other cultural artifacts. So this is very serious. I am aware of time, so I do have much more in the written testimony if you'd like to ask. But thank you for your time today, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Kane. Well, extremist groups, including QAnon followers, ISIS, and white supremacists, certainly have expanded their ranks by recruiting individuals on major social media platforms. The Christchurch shooter who killed 51 people and inspired the Poway and El Paso shooters was radicalized on YouTube and live streamed his attacks on Facebook to rally others to his cause. 3 years later, a shooter in Buffalo, New York, streamed his attack on Twitch, which acted quickly to take it down, but the video was soon circulating widely on Facebook. Mr. Rutter, you could tell this committee, why do these platforms' recommendation algorithms spread this extremist content just so rapidly?
Thank you for the question. So the way to understand these recommendations, they don't have intentionality about specific types of content. But the way they work is they assemble a massive amount of information, they model everything about you, your usage, your interests, your geography, who you're connected to, what you've engaged with historically, and then they model the content and they try to match those optimally. And what makes this so dangerous is there's a positive feedback loop. And if you pick something not controversial, just pick a hobby, knitting, for example. If I think that you're somewhat into knitting, I might recommend some knitting content to you because I believe you'll engage with it. You do engage with it, that both makes you more interested in knitting because you're doing the hobby more, but also it feeds back to the algorithm, which then has signal that you do like more of this content. So the next day or the next session, it's more confident that you will engage in this content and you'll go further down the rabbit hole. Obviously with knitting, that's fine, but this is true for all sorts of content. Because of this feedback loop, if you have some proclivity or some interest in some topic, you will be fed more of that. That generally feeds your interest, and you're fed more and more. And that's why we see people that start off with more things in common than differences, sort of splitting and fracturing as they each go into their worlds that are more and more different and have less in common with other people. This is all an inevitable consequence of this optimization of driving engagement.
Well, Sir Rutter, in terms of content that can take you down the extremist, are companies able to change some of those algorithms to prevent that from occurring, at least with that kind of content, and how would that work?
You certainly could, in theory. It will never happen given the current incentive structure. So these are for-profit companies. They are incented to maximize profit, and before they have realizable profits, they are incented to show massive user growth to convince investors that they will be massively profitable in the future. The way they do that is getting people to come back to their platform over and over. The way they do that is for optimizing engagement. So as long as the algorithms are optimizing for showing you things that you will engage with, we will always have this positive feedback loop property. I show you something you're interested in, you get more interested in it, you're more likely to keep engaging. So you can build an AI to train for anything, but you pick an incentive based on the overarching incentive of the environment you find yourself in. In this case, a public company that's reporting to shareholders. So until those incentives change, we should not expect the AI to optimize for anything other than engagement and profit maximization.
Mr. Rutter, we're going to hear later this afternoon from chief product officers at some of these major companies. Is it possible for them to set different priorities for product development to address the spread of extremist content? Is that within their purview, and is that something they should be able to talk about?
In practice, it's not possible. And the reason is, these are just individuals. This isn't a matter of a few bad eggs running companies. This is a system that these people find themselves in. They're in a system where they have to report user growth, engagement, attention, increasing attention from the users, and profit. And I should add, this attention game is a race to the bottom. If I build a product that is less addictive than a competitor's product, by definition, user eyeballs and attention will go over to the competitor. So then I have to, in turn, make my product more addictive to pull people back, or I'll quickly be abandoned by investors. So given that structure, there is no way that a product leader or any other executive at a company could optimize for anything other than those core metrics, engagement and revenue, because that's the system they find themselves in.
So they can't do it by themselves. It has to be broader than that. But they're at the front end of that, or at the beginning of that, to understand exactly how that incentive structure, how those priorities shape the work that they do. They can talk about that, I suspect.
They could talk about that. They are doing exactly what you would expect them to do, given the environment they find themselves in. So as long as the incentives of those companies are what they are, they will continue to behave the way they are behaving, and if they didn't, it would hurt the trajectory of the company.
Very good. Mr. Boland, why are the actions taken by trust and security teams at these platforms just not enough to deal with this problem? We're going to hear a lot about these teams, I think, this afternoon. Why is that not enough?
Yeah, I imagine that you'll hear that there are significant investments from the companies in trust and safety, and it is true they make some investments. The important thing to think about with trust and safety effort is that if it is siloed from the rest of the process, if it is a last check safeguard or a group that is small and not a core part of the way that people build products, it will always be an afterthought. And it will always be a team that has to fight in the battle of trade-offs between their ways that they would like to improve trust and safety and impacts to growth. And impacts to growth translate to impacts to revenue. That dual tension of not receiving enough resources and being at odds with the product development teams and the product development process makes it so that team has to fight for any sort of interventions they want to put in place. You can change the way that product teams could work with those organizations. A good example would be the efforts that Facebook is now putting in place around privacy. So for a number of years, we know that Facebook and Meta had not been at the top of its game on privacy. After the last set of issues with the FTC, the company has invested significantly in efforts around privacy and has made that something that the product teams and product managers actually have to care about. So as long as that team in trust and safety is off to the side, if there aren't the incentives in place that say to the company, you really have to make sure that when people are making day-to-day decisions, they are prioritizing these efforts, that team is fighting a losing battle, both in resources, because they're battling against a number of people, and incentives at the company, because they have to justify every single change that they want to make. It's not a core part of how the teams think.
And so at best, they're going to be follow-up. The products are going to get launched. They're going to potentially cause problems. That team may have even recognized, but they weren't able to interject that effectively during the product development phase. And then later they may be engaged, but at that point, the genie's out of the bottle, so to speak, before that they can get engaged. Is that correct?
That's correct. My experience was that, and you can kind of understand this if you think about where these companies started and the incredibly short period of time that they've grown to be as successful as they are. These are, they still feel like startups in the way that the leaders think, even though these are some of the biggest companies in the world. At the beginning of their life cycle, it was about trying to figure out products that could grow and grow effectively in the world, and has gone to a point where they haven't matured out of that stage. So, you know, I think that we can get to a point where these companies could do more in that space. We just haven't seen them make that transition into a more responsible set of activities.
Great, thank you. Ranking Member Portman, you're recognized for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We've got a good group of members here, so I'll keep within the time, and I want to focus on TikTok first. And we've talked about TikTok being the most popular social media app in the United States. I also think it poses a risk to our national security, and I want to dig deeper into that today with both of these panels, this one and then when the TikTok representatives are here later. My understanding is that under Chinese law, the Chinese Communist Party can access data of tech companies that are run out of China or have parent companies that are run out of China. Both ByteDance and TikTok have offices and they have employees in Beijing. So, Mr. Kane, under Chinese law, does TikTok have a legal obligation to give U.S. user data to the Chinese Communist Party?
Oh, yes, absolutely. TikTok executives will, under Chinese law, face a minimum of 20 days detention if they refuse to turn over data on anyone in the world. And you know, this could be anybody in China, anybody who's traveling through China, through Hong Kong. This is a documented legal situation, and it's not something that TikTok, despite claiming to be an American company, can avoid. I'd also like to point out that TikTok does dodge this question frequently by trying to point out that it is run by a Cayman Islands holding company, a shell company, essentially. This is a red herring to distract from the issue at hand. So the American company, TikTok, and the Chinese company, ByteDance, both report to this Cayman Islands shell company. The company has never said how many people actually work for the shell company, the holding company, but we do know that the CEO of ByteDance and the CEO of TikTok are the same person. So this is listed on the Cayman Islands registry. The CEO is the same person running the ByteDance company in China, according to their website.
Let me dig a little deep here because we're going to hear from TikTok later, and based on the testimony we've received from them in advance, I think they are going to say they have not provided data to the Chinese Communist Party. Even if CCP requested data, they said they would not share it with them. Again, does China need to make a request to access this data, or does China have the capability to access it at will?
I'm not aware of the Chinese government having the ability to, simply open a computer and access it at will. It would usually happen through somebody in ByteDance or in TikTok. This has already been demonstrated and documented. So there was a BuzzFeed report that came out a few months ago, which contained 20 leaked audio files from internal meetings at TikTok, in which TikTok employees said that they had to go through Chinese employees to understand how American data was being shared. It also pointed out that employees were saying that there is an individual in Beijing who is called the master administrator. We don't know who that is yet, but this person, according to them, had access to all data in the TikTok system. So when they say that this data is being kept separate, this is it's simply a point that's been disproven already, because we have documentation that shows that the data has been shared extensively.
Okay, well, we'll have a chance to talk to TikTok about that, but I appreciate your work on this and your testimony today. We have calls for us to legislate more in this area generally. We talked about that earlier, regulations, legislation. My concern is that we really don't know what's behind the curtain, the black box, so to speak. We proposed this legislation called the Platform Accountability and Transparency Act to require the largest tech platforms to share data, again, with vetted, independent researchers and other investigators. So we know what's happening with regard to user privacy, content moderation, product development. We talked about the bias that I believe is out there in social media today with many of the companies and other practices. So, Mr. Boland, you talked a little about this in your testimony. I see in your written testimony you said to solve the problem of transparency, we must require platforms to move beyond the black box with legislation like the Platform Transparency and Accountability Act. Can you explain why that legislation is needed and how it would be used?
Thank you, Senator. Yes, I believe that the Platform Accountability and Transparency Act is one of the most important pieces of legislation that is before you all. It's not sufficient because we have to address the incentives that we've been talking about, but to begin with, we are at a point where we're supposed to trust what the companies are telling us. And the companies are telling us very little. So I think Facebook, to their credit, is telling us the most, but it's kind of like a grade of a D out of like a A through F grading system. They're not telling us much, but they're telling us more than everybody else, especially YouTube and TikTok. In order to understand the issues that we're concerned about with hate speech and the way that these algorithms can influence people, we need to have a public understanding and a public accountability of what happens on these platforms. There are two parts of transparency that are very important. One is understanding what happens with moderation. So what are the active decisions that companies are taking to remove content or make decisions around content? There's another critically important part that is around what are the decisions that the algorithms built by these companies are taking to distribute content to people. So if you have companies reporting to you what they'd like to, and I'm sure you'll hear from them this afternoon, a lot of averages, a lot of numbers that kind of gloss over the concerns. If you look at averages across these large populations, you miss the story. If you think about 220 some odd million Americans who are on Facebook, if 1% of them is receiving an extremely hate-filled feed or a radicalizing feed, that's over 2 million people who are receiving really problematic content. In the types of data that you're hearing today, that you're receiving today, you get an average, which is incredibly unhelpful. So by empowering researchers to help us understand the problem, we can do a couple of things. One, we can help the platforms because today they're making the decisions on their own, and I believe that these are decisions that should be influenced by the public. And two, then you can bring additional accountability through an organization that has clear oversight over these platforms. Whether that be through new rules or new fines that you levy against the companies, you have the ability to understand how to direct them. So today, you don't know what's happening on the platforms. You have to trust the companies. I lost my trust with the companies of what they were doing and what Meta was doing. I think we should move beyond trust to helping our researchers and journalists understand the platforms better.
Okay. To the other two, quickly, Mr. Kane and Mr. Rutter, do you disagree with anything that was said about the need for more transparency? Just quickly, I've got very little time.
I 100% agree.
I 100% agree, and I think that this committee is uniquely poised, given its subpoena powers, to enforce transparency.
Okay. I'll have additional questions later. Again, we've got so many members here. I want to respect the time, but I appreciate your testimony.
Thank you, Ranking Member Portman. Senator Johnson, you're recognized for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Listen, I think we all agree this is a big problem. It's my definition of a problem. There's no easy solution. As chairman of this committee, I would meet with Facebook, and I appreciate what they were trying to do to pull down Islamic terror type of content. So I think we all agree that we don't want to be disseminating extremist, violent, inducing type of behavior through these platforms, but we also need to protect free speech as well. So it's a real tension. It's a real balancing act. I think Mr. Boland, I think you said, talked about the term extremism and harmful content. But I guess that's all in the eye of the beholder, isn't it? I mean, it's difficult to define. And I guess what I want to focus on a little bit is, where do we draw the line in terms of taking down content that we all would agree is extreme and could induce violence versus censoring legitimate political debate? I don't know, Mr. Rutter, do you have any idea what percentage of Twitter employees are conservative versus liberal?
I have no idea.
You think it's probably pretty heavily tilted to the left, correct?
I don't know.
Well, I think you do. Mr. Boland, would you want to answer that question?
I just don't know. I mean,
okay. Mr. Kane? It's obvious, but
my only knowledge is China tech and TikTok. I'm not as familiar with that area.
So let me move on. Let me use an example that I think we're all aware of. Okay, the 800-pound gorilla in the room. Let's talk about the Hunter Biden laptop. Mr. Rutter, do you believe that, like Washington Post, that there's authentic information on that laptop?
I'm not sure. I will say that These are massive platforms. They're billions of pieces of content
I've got
a
very
day.
little time.
I don't know.
Mr. Boland, do you know whether, do you assume that's authentic information on the laptop?
I don't have an opinion on the laptop.
Oh, okay. So Twitter was actually very effective when they blocked the New York Post articles on the Hunter Biden laptop. We had Jack Dorsey in front of the Commerce Committee back in, I think, October 2020, and both Senator Cruz and myself asked him, because we were talking about, Russians using the platforms to impact our elections, and everybody agrees that could happen. We asked Mr. Dorsey, do you believe Twitter could impact the election? Mr. Dorsey said no. Mr. Rutter, do you believe Twitter has the capability of impacting the election?
I think all these social platforms, they're so massive, it's hard to believe that they're not impacting.
Mr. Boland, do you believe that as well?
Yeah, these platforms absolutely have influence, and I believe they influence.
Mr. Kane?
Absolutely.
Okay, so there is a problem right there, okay? And I appreciate you acknowledging that fact. We had 51 former intelligence officials. I have no idea on what basis they wrote this letter. They came out immediately. I think it might be, because the FBI had a scheme in August of 2020 to downplay the derogatory information on the Hunter Biden laptop. But they came out and said that the laptop had all the earmarks of a Russian information operation. Seems to me like that letter itself was an information operation. So we have this platform that censored. The platform censored that. Facebook throttled it back. We actually took a poll on this. I didn't, but a company called Media Research Center poll. This is after the election, 1,715 voters, 750 voters in 7 swing states of Biden voters who were unaware of the emails, text, testimony, banking transactions on the laptop, as well as Senator Grassley's and my report, which was based on interviews with U.S. persons and U.S. documents. Okay? And 79% of those Biden voters said they would still vote for him, but 16% said they would not. 4% they'd either switch their vote to President Trump, 4% would vote for third party, 4% would skip voting altogether, 5% would not have voted at all. Pretty strong evidence that what Facebook and Twitter did impacted the 2020 election to a far greater extent than anything Russia ever could have hoped to have done in 2016 or 2020. I want to talk about a little other disinformation coming out of this committee. The day or two after Senator Grassley and I issued our report, based on U.S. documents, interviews with U.S. persons, our now committee chairman, who was then committee ranking member, issued a press release, said, Peters Wyden responds to a Republican effort to amplify Russian disinformation. He said, I generated a partisan political report that is rooted in Russian disinformation. Mr. Chairman, do you want to retract that false allegation now? Now that we know that the Hunter Biden laptop is accurate, that there has not been one scintilla of information provided in Senator Grassley's and my report that has ever been refuted. It was 100% accurate. And yet you, as ranking member of the committee, accused me repeatedly of soliciting and disseminating Russian disinformation. Do you want to retract your false allegation here that you issued in your press release on September 23rd?
No, let's just focus on what we're trying to.
Well, I'm focusing on this because this is exactly the type of harm we can do to our political process when you have these big tech companies engaging in political debate, censoring one side of the political spectrum and amplifying the false allegations of another side. Do any one of you want to dispute that?
Well, Senator, I think it's important that we get the data to know. This is why the Platform Accountability and Transparency Act is so critical to our globe and our nation, is that if you were able to look at the data to understand what had happened from content moderation and you were able to see the distribution, you could compare that data across the platforms and see what sort of impact that it had. Absent that, there's a lot of conjecture.
So let me just, one part of it, transparency, would be to at least have people who at least used to work or work for these platforms to at least acknowledge the highly political nature of the individuals who work in them, just acknowledge it. I mean, it's obvious to everybody. I mean, Mr. Zuckerberg spent, what, about $500 million impacting the 2020 election, took over the Green Bay election system in a highly partisan fashion. About 95% of the money he spent were in Democrat strongholds in Wisconsin. Can we at least acknowledge that there's enormous political activity going on, partisan activity going on within these social media companies, rather than just try and bury it? Let's be honest. Let's be transparent, but let's be honest in our transparency.
I agree with you on the request for transparency. In my experience, outside of whether someone had a certain political leaning or not, I didn't see political leanings shape the decisions that were made inside the company, per my experience and what I saw.
Okay, well, I saw it in their censoring the New York Post article prior to the 2020 election, and I think it's pretty obvious. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Langford, you are recognized for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Kane, you've spent a lot of time studying authoritarian regimes and how they use social media to be able to literally control their own populations. Chinese government obviously doing this with the Uyghurs and what they have done. In that case, you've spent a lot of time studying and going through. One of those features that's in TikTok, for instance, and in several platforms, is the permissions that's actually done there. When you join it, you use this free platform. The user gives ByteDance, TikTok, whoever it may be, the opportunity to be able to open their microphone, to use facial recognition, to be able to store data on that. How is that information used in an authoritarian regime?
An authoritarian regime such as China will attempt to get access to that data and use it to build artificial intelligence capabilities that might involve espionage, spying on military officials, government officials. This is a major Trojan horse that needs to be dealt with, and the Chinese government has made clear in its national artificial intelligence strategies that it does need data, that data is its biggest target.
Right. One of the things that I've seen from TikTok even recently is the ability to be able to keep up with keystrokes. If you use their app to be able to then go to other websites that they can then track your keystrokes, that would include credit card numbers, that would include passwords, user IDs, all of those things as well. Factual or not factual?
Factual. You are absolutely correct, Senator.
So they have made the statement publicly, well, we don't use that for any other purposes, we just maintain that. That is now owned by the Chinese government. At that point, if it's going through TikTok, they have access through that to be able to get usernames, passwords, facial recognition, everything else on this. So that's the building of a database system. This is not some hypothetical possible thing. This is actually occurring.
Precisely, Senator. This is occurring. This is the data so TikTok does gather large numbers of data, and there was one recent study by Citizen Lab, which does work on this, which found that TikTok does gather unusually large amounts of data from its users. There was the key logging software that was found recently and reported on. TikTok has said that they don't use this, but it's there, and if the Chinese Communist Party wants to get access to it, they have the power to do it.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Rutter, I want to ask you a little bit about a value system. You have a unique perspective from coming from Twitter and then outside of it to be able to look backwards on this. It's unusual to me that Twitter is blocked in many authoritarian countries, but yet the leaders of those countries are allowed to be on Twitter and to be able to put out authoritarian propaganda, basically. They're still allowed to be able to do that. Twitter's value system seems to shift from country to country based on that country. Even if that country blocks them from a platform, they're still allowed to be able to put out the propaganda from that platform. Tell me, am I wrong on this? What have you seen?
So Twitter certainly is obligated to follow the laws of all the countries in it's operated.
Sure.
I think that's a consequence of what you're seeing.
But it also seems to be a patchwork of values in these countries where in our country they'll say, we really stand strong for this principle, but in another country they don't.
I think that's a fair characterization.
So is that a problem long-term, or giving authoritarian regimes a platform through that is just a matter of having customers there, even if those countries actually even block the use of Twitter in their country?
So I think the bigger problem is the consequences of their overwhelming incentive model. So that is probably a not having that deeply specific about that example of per country variation. That is a consequence of trying to get everyone to use the platform and then being subject to some constraints, whether it's local governments or some other constraints. I think the broader problem is the consequences of who sees what content and what that does to people in the real world as a function of the incentive structure that is created for these companies.
Recent testimony on Twitter has come out that they have had on their team Chinese spies, individuals that work for the Indian government, individuals that work for the Saudi government that were on the staff and were funneling information back to those authoritarian regimes from the staff. I would assume Twitter has a process of actually going through and vetting their employees. I'm making an assumption that while you were there, you saw some of the vetting of how this actually happens. How are they vetting their employees, or to be able to evaluate individuals so they don't end up with Chinese spies, Saudi employees from the Saudi government or required from the Indian government, for instance?
So it may have changed in the time that I was there. Certainly nothing, there is background checks and other things you go through when you get hired, but there's nothing I saw that made me think that process was designed to counteract a threat model of governments inserting spies. It was much more pedestrian of a process than that.
Would Twitter be, it seems to be a different issue when you talk about the Indian government saying we're requiring our individuals to actually be on your staff, to be able to be in the process, or to allow individuals, as was accused from the Saudi government, to be there on the staff. That doesn't seem to be a vetting issue. That seems to be a requirement. If you're in our country, we also require backdoor access, basically.
I'm not sure I'm familiar with the specific rules from India and Saudi Arabia in terms of operating the country.
Fair enough. But this is an issue. We'll have an opportunity in the second panel to be able to talk about this. Mr. Boland, you've spoken out often on the algorithms that are out there and dealing with basically how the platforms seem to engage angry comments. The angrier that you become, the more it helps the algorithm to be able to engage and to be able to place this. I have done a recommendation to Facebook for years to say, why couldn't the page owner, in that sense, be able to take the comments? If people want to make comments, those comments come to the page itself, that individual, but other individuals can't see it. So there's basically an option that you could create to say, I turn off the public viewing of all the comments. If you want to make comments to me and we want to have dialogue, you can do that, but it prevents people that make comments on my page from attacking other people that make comments on the page. Basically what Facebook has created is a place for people to scream at each other in a lot of the political dialogue, and it's pretty hostile, and then it reinforces the anger comments to continue to be able to drive that. What I'm describing to you of giving the user, the owner of a page, the option to be able to make the comments between myself and those that are making comments so they can't attack each other, is that technically possible to be able to do?
Yeah, that's technically possible to be able to do. I think an important step for a lot of the product development work is back to this transparency point of if we could have researchers and academics involved in evaluating the different types of scenarios here and the trade-offs. I think that could move us a lot faster forward.
Yeah, the value system of Facebook seems to be that we want that engagement across and that anger and that attack to each other because that keeps people engaged. So instead of trying to lower the temperature and saying on this page the temperature is going to be lower, it seems to be high temperature as many places as possible. And the anger portion of it, and the anger emoji or anger responses seem to build in that algorithm to continue to accelerate coming back to that page over and over again.
Yeah, I think an important point that Alex has made is that the algorithm knows no temperature. It doesn't know if something's charged or not charged. It just knows whether it gets a result. It knows if it gets engagement. And so without there being a qualitative view over the kinds of content, the algorithms will just chase what they're told to chase. And they're really, really good at it. They're really, really good at going after the metrics that they're given. And as machine learning techniques improve, you'll see more and more of that. So, the idea that it chases that kind of content, if that's what gets engagement and that's what gets reaction, that's what's going to grow in the system.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Thank you, Senator Langford. Senator Romney, you're recognized for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Rutter, your comments about the incentives of a corporation are accurate, which is they're trying to make as much money as they can, and to do so, they're trying to get as many eyeballs as they can. Every newspaper, every magazine, every TV show, every broadcaster, every radio station does the same thing, which is how can we get more eyeballs, what gets more attention. And what we're seeing with social media is not entirely unprecedented. I imagine I wasn't around in the early days of broadcast, but I presume it was Wild West initially, and then the there was threat of government intervention to tell you who could advertise and what they could advertise and what words could be said and how much sex and violence could be allowed. And the industry came together and said, okay, we're going to start grading things and establishing rules. Ultimately, from what I understand, the government also established an entity to establish rules for broadcasting, saying what you could show at certain hours of the day, how much sex and violence and so forth could be on broadcast networks. And we haven't done that with regards to social media. Social media is far more engaging and captivating of our young people, as well as many adults, than broadcast was. And I wonder whether we need to do this. One, whether the industry should not come together and talk about its own decision-making, the rules, where they draw the lines, and say, yeah, these are things we are all going to agree to. And if the industry doesn't do that, whether government should. Whether we should establish an agency to say, hey, these are the rules, and you're all going to have to follow them. Is the industry willing to take action of that nature? Could it? Should it? And if not, should government? And I'll ask you, Mr. Rutter, first, and then Mr. Boland and Mr. Kane.
So I think that probably the best predictor here is just past behavior. So far, my observation is the industry will share information which is not the information you would share if you were genuinely interested in providing transparency. Brian's talked somewhat about sharing an average when you have a distribution which is so non-uniform that an average is not a useful statistic. We see that. We see exact numbers being shared. I view this as a two-step process. The first is we actually don't know what's happening on these networks today, and that's why a lot of the conversation about networks devolves into cherry-picking examples to prove something that I believe these networks are doing. And you can also prove that they have a bias in the other direction, depending on which example you cherry pick. The first step is we need statistically representative, unbiased, raw data that can be processed, and then we understand what they're actually doing. I think if we had a better view of what they were actually doing in a representative way, we could then talk about, do we believe their incentives are going to create the right outcome? What is the true impact of that? And then, faced with that shared understanding of what the networks are doing, it's possible, to your point, that maybe the companies would come together and decide to self-regulate because they realize the specter of someone else regulating them is worse. I'm not sure. But I think really the first step is demanding the transparency so we have a shared view on what's actually happening on these things.
Yeah, thank you. Mr. Boland?
Yeah, I think that usually you see industries take self-regulatory steps when they feel like external pressures or legislation's impending. And,
right.
I don't believe that they feel that with the United States today. And I think that drives a decision from them to kind of let the status quo go. I think what's particularly terrifying is that we don't know what's happening on these platforms today. The nice thing about broadcast, excuse me, is that you know what was broadcast. Everyone could see what was being broadcast. With the way that our feeds work today, you have such a distribution of content that it can look at, on an average basis, that things are getting better. The industry could tell you, we're making improvements. Here's the average that shows you what we're doing. But for the person who has the 99th percentile most hate-filled feed, or the group of people who have that 99th percentile most extremist feed, they may be seeing an increase in the types of harmful content that we'll never know. So in an era where you see steps being made to reduce transparency, so Meta provided a lot more transparency 3 years ago than they provide today. That transparency is decreasing. None of the other platforms are taking steps in that regard to increase transparency. And you have an increased TikTokization of media, in that Facebook is now moving towards a TikTok model, where it's not just friends and family content, it is unconnected, algorithmically driven content. These kind of fringes, these pockets are going to grow. We'll never see them unless we mandate that we get to see them.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Mr. Kane?
Thank you, Senator Romney, for the question. TikTok has seen an alarming number of leaks get out in the press, which does suggest, and I have spoken personally with former TikTok employees who have been disgruntled, who say that the company is not transparent, that it's not doing what it promises. Since it has this connection to the Chinese Communist Party, it will not be transparent about what it's doing. This algorithm, we don't know what's behind the curtain. China is not a place that values transparency. It is a one-party authoritarian state and the most sophisticated police state in the world. world. I don't think we can, count on a company such as TikTok or its parent ByteDance to do anything that will actually address the problems at hand. I think that, to be honest, this committee is uniquely placed to address this problem of transparency, because the subpoena power that can be used here, I think, would require TikTok to open up its emails, show us what's really going on, and show us what the China-based executives are saying with the American executives.
Yeah, I must admit I share your view in that regard, although I'm probably even more alarmist than you, which is I question whether we should allow an authoritarian regime to have a social media capability of the scale they have in our country, gathering the data they have. I think that's a huge risk for us. I have a lot of kids and grandkids, particularly grandkids these days, very concerned about their exposure to social media. Have other countries figured a better way, and I know I don't have a lot of time here, but a better way to try and reduce the draw and the compelling nature of social media? I understand China, for instance, between various TikTok segments, they have a 5-second gap where the screening, I guess, goes blank or something. But are we not doing even what other nations are doing to try and protect our kids? And I'll let anyone wants to respond to that. Maybe Brian, if you want to take that.
Yeah, it's a tricky one in that you're dealing with incentives you would mandate versus steps you'd like to see the companies take on their own. There are steps that you're describing friction, right? That slow down the kind of effective process. There are known steps you can take to introduce friction in the products.
Have other nations done? Have some of the other nations done some of those things?
I don't know of mandated friction. I think Europe has done a very good job of starting to move towards required transparency. So we'll see how that moves, but I haven't seen the prescriptive type of product stuff.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Senator Romney. Senator Hawley, you're recognized for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to the witnesses for being here. Mr. Boland, let me start with you. Can you tell me, when were you at Facebook?
I was there 2009 through November 2020.
November 2020. Was it normal in the time that you were at Facebook for executives or team members at Facebook, not even have to be executives, to coordinate closely with the United States government?
I'm not aware of that.
You were never in any such meetings?
No.
You never had any contact with U.S. government employees in your time at Facebook?
Not that I can recall.
Would you be surprised to know that on July 16th, 2021, an employee at Facebook wrote to the Department of Health and Human Services saying, "I know our teams met today to better understand the scope of what the White House expects from us on misinformation going forward." On July 23rd, 2021, Facebook employee thanked HHS for taking the time to meet earlier today. Wanted to make sure you saw the steps we just took this past week to adjust policies and what we are removing with respect to misinformation. That included, I'm quoting, increasing the strength of our demotions for COVID and vaccine-related content. On April 16th, 2021, Rob Flaherty at the White House circulated a Zoom meeting invitation stating White House staff will be briefed on vaccine misinfo. On April 7th, 2021, a Facebook employee thanked the CDC for responding to misinformation queries. We'll get moving now to be able to remove all but that one claim as soon as the announcement and authorization happens. On July 28th, 2022, that's this year, Facebook employee reached out to CDC about doing a monthly misinfo/debunking meeting. CDC responded, yes, we would love to do that. On May 11th, 2021, Facebook employees organized a Be on the Lookout meeting with CDC officials. On July 20th, 2021, Clark Humphrey at the White House emailed Dave Sumner and others at Facebook asking any way we can get this pulled down, and cited an Instagram account. Within 46 seconds, Facebook replied, quote, "Yep, we are on it," end quote, and down the account went. Is that normal? Was that normal in your time at Facebook?
I don't have experience around that.
So you have no knowledge of anything like this? Nothing like this ever happened, and then presto, it started happening just suddenly in 2020 as soon as you left?
I didn't have personal experience of that, or I didn't hear.
And you don't know anything about it at all? You've never heard of anything like this happening ever?
I don't.
That's remarkable. I thought that you were the former vice president of partnerships, product marketing, partner engineering, marketing, strategic operations, and analytics at Facebook.
It's true.
And none of this ever happened. Why did it start happening, do you think, as soon as you left? What do you think drove this kind of collaboration where you have Facebook becoming an arm of the United States government, more specifically the White House, to censor private information, personal speech at the behest of government officials?
So it's hard for me to comment on the specific context of the content we're talking about, whether it was public content or whether it was personal content. I do know that from what I've read, and probably the same documents that you have access to, that there were a lot of steps taken around COVID response and COVID misinformation that may have presented a unique scenario and a unique situation where the company took steps to coordinate that way.
Took steps to coordinate, by which you mean to censor the speech of ordinary Americans at the behest of the President of the United States and his administration. I commend to everyone who's interested these emails, which were discovered as part of litigation led by the state of Missouri and other states as they're suing these tech companies, including your former employer, Mr. Boland, which for the record is one of the worst companies in America. And they've discovered this trove of information, extensive coordination, extensive between Facebook and the Biden administration, targeting the speech of ordinary Americans. And by the way, for standards that are ever shifting, ever shifting. You know, early on, if you questioned if the vaccine had anything to, if you questioned that the COVID had anything to do with a lab, you were marked as disinformation, you were censored, only to have the President of the United States later admit that the possibility that COVID has some lab nexus is in fact a very distinct possibility that our intelligence communities think is actually quite a viable theory. We've seen the same thing with people who have questions about masks, who have questions about vaccine efficacy. It's really quite remarkable. Let me just ask you this. What safeguards, when you were at Facebook, what safeguards were in place to protect Americans from having their speech censored or having government censors like this access personal information?
So during my time there, the company was my experience with the company was more reluctant to take down speech and very careful about trying to remove content. I also don't think the company studied the content on the platform as heavily as you would like.
You don't think that so they didn't do things like, not like what they were doing later when they were looking at particular private Instagram accounts and removing them at the behest of the White House? You're saying that didn't happen while you were there?
That's not a scenario that I ran across. It's hard for me to comment on a COVID pandemic response, which I think a lot of things were outside of the norm.
I'll just say this. I find it hard to believe that suddenly Facebook became an entirely different entity and was interfacing with the United States government in an entirely different way only when COVID happened. I mean, maybe, but I doubt it. Let me ask you, Mr. Rutter, is that how I pronounce your name, by the way?
Rutter, that's correct.
Rutter, okay. Let me ask you this. You were an engineer at Twitter, is that right?
Correct, yep.
You were the Senior Vice President for Engineering?
Yes.
So yesterday, Mr. Zatko testified to another committee I sit on that 4,000 engineers at Twitter had access to all of the personal information, user data, geolocations of Twitter users. Is that accurate?
So I've never met him, and he joined the company after I left, so I don't know if that particular claim is accurate.
But he said all the engineers, you were an engineer. Did you have access to user data?
When I was there, I don't know if it was all the engineers.
Did you have access to user data?
Well, I was the head of engineering for the whole company.
Did you have access to user data? I'm looking for a yes or a no.
I'll
just remind you.
No.
You didn't have access to user data?
I think I could have gotten it.
I'm sorry?
I think I could have gotten it.
Oh, okay. Well, if you can get it, that's what we call access. So you did have access to user data. Is that a yes?
In theory, I probably could have, yeah.
That's
That's probably right. Yeah, I probably could.
Okay, you did. Did you ever access any user data?
No.
Were you aware of Twitter engineers ever doxing members of users?
No.
Were you aware of Twitter engineers ever taking over an account and tweeting out or altering the content of that account? Mr. Zatko said he thought that had happened.
I'm not aware of that.
Okay. Lots to unpack there. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Hawley, Senator Rosen, you're recognized for your questions.
Thank you, Chairman Peters, Ranking Member Portman. Thank you for witnesses for being here today. Transparency, accountability, I guess those are the words of the day, because we know that social media companies, of course, what do? I'm a former computer programmer. Data is power. How you analyze the data tells a story if you're smart enough to listen to it. And you collect the demographic behavioral data from consumers in order to enhance the predictive engagement algorithms to target the consumers with ad, recommendations based on other content, perceived interest, or even vulnerabilities. This is really great when you're shopping for a new outfit or some new furniture. Maybe not so great when you're on an extremist or violent website or harmful or illegal content. And so when it comes to that harmful or illegal content, there has to be greater transparency into the platform promotion mechanisms, how the content ultimately spreads from platform to platform, so that I believe consumers, and I'll say not just the individual, we have small businesses, hospitals, schools, everyone are on these platforms in some form or fashion. So when we say consumer, we can go from the individual right up to our full national security, that we understand better the algorithms that amplify the content and how these things reach their feed. And so some social media platforms, for example, they have standards in place for removing content that promotes Holocaust denial or distortion. They're often inconsistent with implementing the policies, but the content flourishes. So I'm going to kind of cut right to the chase. And so, Mr. Rutter and then Mr. Boland, is there a difference now in how predictive user engagement algorithms behave for harmful, illegal, or extremist content versus other content? And how might we modify or regulate an otherwise agnostic algorithm? It's math. It's agnostic, to your point, an agnostic algorithm to identify illegal, certainly illegal or extremist content. How do we take the agnostic out of the math? Mr. Rutter.
So today the algorithms are doing exactly what they're incented to do, which is maximize attention on the platform. If you changed what those companies were accountable for, these companies are very smart. They have a lot of engineers and a lot of money and a lot of computational power. They would change what the algorithms do. So for example, if certain types of content if companies were penalized for sharing certain types of content, these algorithms would no longer promote that content because it would be not optimal for them to do so. The extra benefit they get from the attention and the usage would be outweighed by whatever the penalty was. So this is all possible. I think the two takeaways are, one, without transparency, we're not going to know what it's doing today. And two, they will behave optimally in the face of any incentive structure they have. So today it's just maximizing attention, and they're doing exactly what you would expect. But you could change that.
Thank you.
I think it's important to note that not only do we not know what's happening on the platforms don't know what's generally happening on their platforms. The turning point for me to go from having concerns to being publicly vocal about my concerns was when Facebook said nothing on January 6th happened on our platform. And then it turns out after the fact that we find out that there's a lot of stop the steal on the platform, and there were internal concerns around it. In order to change these algorithms, part of it is understanding what is happening, and then as a society having the conversations about what do we think the right distribution is. Facebook has proven that with things like QAnon, after the fact,
right,
after the fire was lit and burned through, they could then adjust it and actually manage the distribution of that type of content. So it is possible when we know what we're managing towards. The problem is that it's all after the fact. It's all after the damage has been done that you then go back and you say, okay, there's been this set of articles or conversations, and finally we go back to address them, rather than saying we have a whole community of researchers and people who could quickly spot things, raise the issues, and then adjust them. It's doable. It's an incredibly hard problem. Like, I'm very sympathetic to the fact that human speech is very complicated and very nuanced.
But the platforms have an unwillingness. They actually want to have this lack of understanding, so they have some deniability on the back end, if that's what you're saying is true. We don't know it's happening. Oh my gosh, it happened after the fact. So their lack of wanting to do the analysis ahead of time and understand their own platform, they're setting themselves up for deniability, in my estimation. But we're going to move on to cybersecurity because I have a few minutes left. We know the whistleblower complaint from Twitter's former head of security depicted they were unable to protect the 238 million users, government agencies, influential figures, heads of state from spam and security breaches. And the complaint alleged the company's servers were running out-of-date and vulnerable software and withheld dire facts about the breaches and lack of protection for user data. I'm really concerned about cybersecurity. Companies are laser-focused on growth, not laser-focused on protection, in my estimation. So individuals, again, small businesses, hospitals, schools, critical infrastructure, all of those things we're responsible for here are at potential risk. And so based on, both your experience working at Facebook and Twitter, is cybersecurity a high enough priority for the large social media platforms? And do the social media platform security teams, do they work alongside product development, application development to protect that cyber attacks? Do you have a hunt forward? Are you looking for these breaches? How are you working that? And how does this threaten our own security, even our national security?
So the teams, they do work alongside engineering, but it's not a primary driver the way product and growth and revenue is. You need to build something that drives usage and revenue and then make it secure enough. So in terms of your question, is it a high enough priority? The answer to that can only be known if you know the nature of the threat and if the bad actors trying to break in are being successful.
So there's no hunt-forward operations built into these things for people trying to breach the data?
Sorry, can you say that again?
There's no kind of hunt-forward, there's no way that people are really actively looking for data breaches. You're finding it after the fact in many cases.
No, there are in some cases some penetration testing and people trying to simulate breaking into something to learn. That happens.
And can you speak to it, Mr. Boland?
Yeah, my sense from Meta's standpoint is that they're quite good and quite invested in protecting people's data, and from a cybersecurity standpoint, which goes to show you that where there is a will and a desire to make progress on issues, I believe they can. This is an area where my experience is they're quite strong.
Thank you. I see my time is up, so I'll yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Rosen. Senator Hassan, you're recognized for your questions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair and Ranking Member Portman, for this hearing, and thank you for our witnesses for being before the committee today. I really appreciate it. I want to start with a question that builds a little bit on what Senator Rosen was discussing, and this is to Mr. Boland and Mr. Rutter. Terrorists have horrifically live-streamed their attacks on social media. These live-streamed attacks in turn inspire other individuals to commit future attacks. Are there ways for social media companies to quickly identify terrorist content so that it's not shared in real time? Mr. Boland, we'll start with you.
I know that particularly for live stream videos that Meta has put considerable resources in AI to try to spot these types of attacks and take them down quickly. I think they've gotten a lot better, obviously, than they were with Christchurch years ago. I think it's an incredibly hard problem. I'm not an expert on the extent of what's possible there, but I do think they've made strides.
Mr. Rutter?
It's certainly possible. It's a hard technical challenge, but you can build algorithms to figure out in real time or near real time the content of videos. They won't be perfect, like any sort of classification or segmentation algorithm, but you could certainly do so. You could work on that.
I mean, this is an ongoing issue because, of course, we're seeing the acceleration from idea to action happening much more quickly, in part because of the influence of social media, too. So I thank you for that, and I'd look forward to following up with you both on it. Another question for the two of you. Facebook is currently running an advertising campaign which is touting the thousands of employees and billions of dollars that the company says it spends on safety and security. These numbers, however, are pretty meaningless without proper context, right? So what specific information or metrics should these companies provide this committee to help us fully understand their actual commitment to safety and security? And Mr. Boland, again, we'll start with you.
Yeah, you're 100% correct on the context of the numbers matter. I think when they first announced their $13 billion over 5 years safety and security number, it was in context of $50 billion in stock buybacks, right? So like a massive imbalance of investment. They also will give you numbers of employees. Numbers of engineers matter. So if you think about these issues, you can have employees who are non-technical who can be in what would be a review queue or a process to look at content, but the really important thing is engineering resources and how many engineers are put in these problems. I would really try to get from the companies an understanding of where they allocate their engineers for these types of problems, right? They don't need to show you their entire org chart and you get to know how many are working on metaverse and whatnot, but these are the numbers working on these safety and security issues, these safety issues, and this is how they're allocated by country, by topic, et cetera. I think that's justifiable to understand and to feel like we have a sense of whether that's adequate relative to the total number of engineering employees.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Rutter?
I think what's important is that we get metrics that are of the form that show what results they're getting, not metrics that basically equate to, well, we're trying real hard, give us a break. That would never work. In Wall Street, you can't tell them we tried really hard to make profit this quarter.
Right.
You have to actually show what the results are.
Yeah.
So if you have transparency over the content and how the content is shared and the engagements on that content, we will be able to study. Independent people can look at, see certain content. Oh, certain content spreads very widely, other content does not.
Yep.
And then after this investment that they've made, has this changed or not? So we need metrics where we can measure the actual result, not just, I tried really hard, so please be happy.
And I'm sorry, one more quick thought there
Sure.
is that I worry that a lot of times, because it's so painful, we focus on these extreme examples of content, the live stream shootings. There is a broad swath of content that influences people that doesn't feel as scary.
Right.
That's the stuff that terrifies me. And that's the stuff that we don't get to see without transparency.
Okay. I thank you both. I thank the whole panel for your testimony, and I'm very grateful for this hearing, and I'll yield back.
Thank you, Senator Hassan. During your opening statements, I think each of you discussed the product development process at these companies, and we've talked at length about that process through the hearing. Mr. Boland, though, you discussed how Facebook does not incentivize limiting the spread of harmful content, but of course prioritizes growth and revenue. So could you tell the committee generally what metrics inform employee compensation at the company? What goes into that?
Employees at Facebook, you kind of receive it's about rewards, right? And so the rewards that you receive is your cash compensation, your stock compensation, then promotions. And generally, if you're building products, you're rewarded on the success of that product. And that product success is defined by some set of metrics around whether that product is being used more. So let's pretend that you're building a video product. The things that you'll care about are the metrics around what are the total watch hours, so how many hours are being spent watching videos, what's the user growth, how many people are using that video product, where does that spread geographically, et cetera. You're incentivized on those hard metrics, and then you're not incentivized around, well, what kind of content are you growing your video with? What's the stuff underneath the hood that's showing up, that's driving this growth? That's not your problem, that's somebody else's problem. Now, there may be company-wide goals where they say, okay, for the company, we're gonna, I wasn't aware of any sort of safety or trust goals, but they could theoretically create one. The problem is that doesn't drive individual behavior. Company goals are kind of there. You don't think about them. You think about what you individually and your team are goaled to deliver. That is always metrics. That's always product growth metrics and success metrics of the product, and not success in are we keeping people safe.
There's not a trust and safety metric.
For the trust and safety team, actually, my understanding is they've been disbanded and moved into a central team. I did not experience products like video or others carrying a metric that was incentivizing trust or safety.
That's not there. Mr. Rutter, was that the case as well?
Yes, I agree with all of that. There's that promotion system, compensation system, review system. The problem with trust and safety metrics, typically companies they'll have 5 top-level goals, let's say, and maybe one of them is trust and safety. The problem is that is at odds with the other metrics, and the other metrics always win. And if I am an engineer building, say, a new live streaming video service, if I launch that product and it gets some usage, that is a feather in my cap. That's something I can say that I did. I can point to its effect. That will help me with promotions, compensation, career advancement. If at the last minute I decide not to launch that product because I realize I can't control some of the safety aspects and we shouldn't do it if we can't do it without certain safeguards, I get 0 credit for that. It's as if I've done nothing for the company over the last X months. So in that incentive structure,
you're in effect, you'll be punished, and your future advancement will probably be questionable as well.
It's no different as a product that I build and then I don't launch because it might not be safe is no different than if I just didn't show up to work.
Right.
In terms of the future credit that I get.
Not a good place for an employee to be.
Correct.
Not a good place, and you can change incentives, and you can change the way that people show up, not even just through goals, but through process. So there was an example where when Facebook started as a desktop site and moved to mobile, Mark Zuckerberg required that all products that were demoed to him showed mobile in their demonstration, that they had designs around that. He kicked the first team out that came in without that design, and suddenly everybody was thinking about mobile designs. If in your process you created an incentive where you said, let's as part of every product design discussion is what are all the harmful ways this product can drive hate or drive extremism or drive polarization, you would have a radical change in the way that people showed up to those meetings and in the process thought about the negative impacts of their product.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, Mr. Boland, before you left, it's my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, but that you voiced objections about how Facebook recommendation algorithms were actually promoting extreme, hateful, and racist content. Is that correct?
That's correct. My concerns were specifically around racist content.
So what was the reaction from your senior leadership within Facebook when you expressed these concerns?
It was disappointing. So I raised the issues, particularly around the distribution of racist content that I was seeing in the CrowdTangle tool, and my concerns that we didn't understand it, and brought forward 3 steps that I felt would be very good internal steps to actually help mitigate the problem. 1, more internal researchers, 2, more data to external researchers, and 3, beefing up CrowdTangle to share more information. I had a range of responses from you're wrong, and that's not the case, that this is driving us, with no evidence, mind you, just I believe you're wrong, and no counter evidence. 2, some, yeah, this might be a problem, but not something that we're working on right now.
But when you say no evidence on those statements that you're wrong, you work for a company that looks at a lot of data and makes decisions based on data, but this is something they wanted to ignore, basically.
Yeah, so a particularly concerning moment for me was when I had my moment where I really came to terms with believing that the product could be causing harm. I started to look at a variety of things that research teams were doing internally to understand what they were seeing. And the internal dialogue and the internal documents, many of which Frances Haugen has shared, were troubling. There was a particular document that was an overview of polarization research from, I think, June of 2020. And that talked about political polarization. And one of the lines said, we have not researched and have very little understanding of racial, ethnic, or religious polarization. That underinvestment was significantly concerning to me.
Yeah. Mr. Rutter, one of the documents submitted by a Twitter whistleblower to the SEC last month was a 2021 study that he commissioned of the site integrity team's capabilities. The study found that Twitter planned to launch a new product, Fleets, just weeks before the 2020 elections. The integrity team, according to that document, I'm quoting the document, said, quote, had to beg the product team not to launch before the election because they did not have the resources or capabilities to take action on misinformation or disinformation on the new product, unquote. The report also found, quote, while product teams do elicit feedback for new product launches, product managers are incentivized to ship products as quickly as possible and thus are willing to accept security risk, end of quote. Are these findings consistent with the pattern of decision-making that you saw?
So with the caveat that that specific example happened after I was there and I can't speak to it, that's absolutely consistent. In fact, I would be surprised, given the incentives at play, if the product team had done anything else. One way we used to talk about product managers is they're, quote unquote, the mini CEOs of their product, and they get consultation from other teams, trust and safety, legal, finance, compliance, but it's their decision to launch or not. And again, there is no possible credit or reward from not launching, whereas there's possibly a credit or reward from launching. And because that they probably had more confidence that it would at least get some usage and potentially drive revenue, there's every reason to launch and not worry about the other issues.
Thank you. Thank you. Ranking Member Portman, any remaining questions?
Well, let me just follow up on that particular issue. Twitter Spaces, an audio function newer to the platform, was allegedly rolled out in such a rush, to your point, that it hadn't been fully tested for safety. Twitter lacked real-time audio content moderation capabilities when they launched it. we're told that in the wake of our withdrawal from Afghanistan, that was exploited. It was exploited by the Taliban and Taliban supporters who used this platform to discuss how cryptocurrency can be used to fund terrorism. First of all, is that accurate? Mr. Rutter, maybe I'll start with you. And second, is that common for Twitter to launch products that lack content moderation capabilities? You said that sometimes they are under pressure to ship products as soon as possible. Was that why this happened?
So it is accurate that they're under pressure to ship products as soon as possible. And Twitter in particular has a history of being very worried about user growth and revenue growth. It's not the runaway success that Facebook or Google are. And so there was often very extreme pressure to launch things. And a saying we had is that if you walk around and ask enough people if you can do something, eventually you will find someone who says no. And the point of that was really to emphasize you just need to get out and do something. And again, the overwhelming metrics are usage, and you would never get credit or be held up as an example or promoted or get more compensation if you didn't do something because of potential negative consequences on the safety side or otherwise. In fact, you would be viewed probably as someone that just says no or has a reason not to take action. There's a huge bias towards taking action and launching things at these companies.
Yeah. So are you aware of this Twitter Spaces issue and the Taliban having exploited it?
That specific example, I'm not.
Okay. Do you think, assuming my example is correct, which I believe it is, that the Platform Accountability and Transparency Act, that PATA would have been helpful there to at least get behind the curtain and figure out why decisions are being made?
So I haven't read the draft of that, but that's it. If my understanding is correct, yes, having more understanding of what these products do and what sort of content is promoted and what the internal algorithms are that drive both decision-making and usage of the products, I think that'd be extremely valuable. And without any of that, I would expect examples such as this to keep happening.
On this trust and safety issue, and specifically the product development and business decision-making processes, Mr. Boland, maybe direct this to you. Meta disbanded its responsible innovation team just last week, it was announced. And did you see that?
I did. It was extremely disappointing.
My understanding is they'd been tasked with addressing harmful effects of product and development processes. So you're saying it was concerning to you. Why are you concerned about it? And tell us about how you interacted with integrity teams while you were at Facebook.
So I know the people who led that team. Very, very high integrity, very intentional about responsible design of products, as the team was named. Without that kind of center of excellence that's helping to shape other teams, I fear that Meta is not going to continue to have that as a part of their conversations. You can think about that group as influencing and indoctrinating, if you will, the engineers to come to the company of how to start to think about some of these issues. It's less hard-coded into the incentive structure, which I think is a missing element, but would have driven really important conversations on how to ethically design products. Disbanding that unit, and I don't believe them when they say that they are making it a part of everything, that they're going to interweave it into the company. That's a very convenient way to dodge the question, in my view. I don't believe they're going to continue to invest in it if it's not a team. And this comes at a time when Meta is building the metaverse. We don't know how the metaverse is going to play out. I am extremely concerned because the paradigms we've seen in the past that we've started to understand around content and content distribution are very, very different in the metaverse. That's an area that if I were this committee, I'd spend a lot of time really trying to understand the risks of the metaverse. It feels very risky to me. It feels like the next space where there'll be underinvestment, and without a team like Responsible Innovation helping to guide some of that thinking, that's concerning.
Again, same question to Mr. Rutter with regard to how to evaluate these trust and safety efforts in general, and specifically something like the Responsible Innovation Team and what impact it's having. Do you think that it would be helpful to have this legislation called the Platform Accountability and Transparency Act?
I think so. If we get from that more information to illuminate what these algorithms are doing and what the incentive structures are, that'd be extremely helpful. I think today we're operating in a vacuum. And what we see, a lot of the public conversation about this is people will cherry pick one example and use it as evidence of whatever their theory is of these companies are doing. That, of course, it must be true because here's one example. The fact of the matter is these companies are so massive and there's so much content, you can cherry pick examples to prove almost anything you want about these companies. And without broad-scale representative data from which we can compute what is being promoted and then reverse engineer what the incentives must be, we're never going to see a change into the things they're optimizing for.
What are your thoughts on that, Mr. Boland?
Yeah, no, I think the issue that we face today is that is we have to trust, and without having a robust set of data to understand what's happening and make these public conversations, not company conversations, is critical. The Meta will like to tell you that they don't want to put their thumb on the scale when it comes to algorithmic distribution. The challenge is that these algorithms were built in a certain way that you're kind of leaning on the scale already. You just don't realize you're leaning on it. So these algorithms today are already doing a lot to shape discourse and to shape what people experience. We don't get to see it. And we have to trust the companies to share with us information that we know that they're not sharing. As I said earlier, I think the Platform Accountability and Transparency Act is a critical first step and we need to do it quickly because these things are accelerating to understand what is actually happening on these platforms.
Mr. Kane, you have the last word.
I do believe that there are a number of issues that were addressed here today that will have significance not only for our democracy within America, but the position of America in the world. There's been major changes that I've seen personally, having been in China and Russia and recently Ukraine, in the world of technology, in the world of social media. And my greatest concern is that we are ceding too much ground to authoritarian regimes that seek to undermine us, and to malign us in whatever way they can. The software that we're using, the AI, the apps, these are ubiquitous. I mean, this is not the Cold War where we had hardware, we had missiles pointed at each other. Now we have smartphones, and it's entirely possible and quite probable that the Chinese Communist Party has launched major incursions into our data within America to try to undermine our liberal democracy.
Well, that's a sobering conclusion, and I don't disagree with you, and I appreciate your testimony and our other experts. Thank you all.
Thank you, Ranking Member Portman. Let me just follow up on just a brief question on transparency. It's pretty clear. We need transparency. We need to have, though, the active involvement of researchers that use that data and researchers, whether they're academics or civil rights groups or rights organizations, journalists, everybody has to be engaged. One pushback we could get, I like your response, is that, do you think there's a ways that we can protect user data and still provide the kind of data that's necessary for these researchers? Is that possible? Mr. Rutter and Mr. Boland?
Yes, this is certainly, you will get that pushback as well as a bunch of other pushback, I'm sure. So one, it's possible we can obfuscate the data, we can generate random ideas, you can hide the personally identifiable information. Secondly, there are examples when third-party reviewers have access to confidential information, and because they operate in a professional manner and are well-trusted, that doesn't mean it leaks out publicly. So, one of the examples I gave was auditors in the course of certifying financial statements see a bunch of internal financial performance that, if it leaked out, would be extremely valuable to competitors. And the reason we have third-party auditors is they're allowed to balance the public's need for information with the company's need to keep information private. So we could do the exact same thing. There are secure computing environments. For example, there's a bunch of healthcare data in the world which has a bunch of personally identifiable information and very strict legislated privacy requirements around that. And that's managed in a way such that people can extract insights from the data without violating individual privacy. We could do the same thing here.
Right, Mr. Boland?
It is absolutely possible and doable. There are some hard aspects to it, but it can be done. I think there's two components that I think are favorable there. One, with the increased TikTokization of services, more and more content is public content. So you're really not dealing with issues around privacy and private data. For private data, Meta was able to solve it with their ads measurement system. So we built a system where we could connect the ads that people saw on Facebook with the purchases that they bought in a physical store. And we were able to do that in a privacy-safe way. If we can do it for ads, you can do it for these other areas as well.
Right. Well, thank you, and I'd like to thank the three of you for your testimony here today. You certainly provided some very insightful contributions to what is a very important conversation. We appreciate your availability to be part of the first panel